Thursday, March 12th, 2020, MONERO 64, home of alternative economics and contrarian views. So things are getting really epic, I would say. President Trump has banned all travel from Europe as of tomorrow, except the UK and Ireland. And the reason for that is that the UK and Ireland are not part of the Schengen Agreement, which allows for free movement within Europe. I'm not sure that makes any sense, though. I think if he's going to ban the whole of Europe, he should have banned UK and Ireland as well. Anyway, today, though, I want to talk about, with the way things are going, we're reaching a point of the ICE 9 lockdown. That's something that Jim Rickards talks about in his The Road to Ruin book. I'm going to look at that today. I think it's very important. And one thing Jim Rickards says is that physical gold and silver are the answers to ICE 9. So what is ICE 9? Before I go into that, let's have a quick look at where the markets are. It's very early this morning here in London. It's 5:45 a.m. Why am I up early? Well, I got up in the middle of the night. I had a look at the markets and saw that the stock market is continuing to plummet. And I checked the news and I saw the news about President Trump putting on a travel ban from Europe. And that's very significant, I have to say. And that's why I've decided to talk about ICE 9. Before that, though, I want to talk about a couple of things. Or one thing, very important thing I saw yesterday in the markets. In spite of the fact that the Dow dropped almost 1,500 points, S&P dropped 141. I would have expected the Treasury bond yields to have dropped because that's what they've been considered, safe havens. But no, the 10-year yield yesterday was up almost 13 basis points, which means that bond prices were going down. Treasury prices were going down. The 30-year was up 12 as well. So we're back above 1% in the 30-year. We're at 135 in the 10-year at just below 0.9. We had been around 0.32 earlier in the week. So I was a little bit kind of perplexed by that. Most of you know I worked in the bond markets for a long time. So I decided to send a message to my friend who still works in the bond markets. He works in the city still. Send him a text, and right away he called me on my phone, and we had a word. And I asked him, how come yields are up with the stock market down so much? And he told me, well, people are now starting to use their profits in treasuries to cover their losses in the corporate bond market, to cover their margins. So very much like gold, we've been talking about how gold hasn't been able to go further. And a lot of people talk about how people use their profits in gold to cover margins. They're doing the same thing in treasuries. I think it's concerning because there won't be any safe havens left. Of course, physical gold and silver are outside the system, and that's where the ICE 9 comes in. And I will talk about that in a minute. My friend doesn't seem as concerned, but that's the way he always is. He's a lot more complacent, and I think he might be too complacent about this. So even to those people who hold bonds, they're not safe, in my opinion, especially non-government bonds, and even government bonds, I think, are under threat. The thing about the bond market, the longer term the maturity in the treasuries, the bigger the move higher was, so the bigger the move down can be. And that could rattle the markets even more. I saw yesterday that The demand for funds in the repo market from the New York Fed is increasing. I think there was 132 billion subscribed. The Fed obliged, of course, and they announced that they're going to increase the amount that they give out to 175 billion. So all is not well. So right now, as I said, it's just before 10 to 6 a.m. We've got the Dow down another 850 points here. So we're at 22,695. S&P 500 to 2,640, down 3.5%. Silver, of course, is getting hit, but not as much. I mean, silver's down just over 1%, while the stock market is down 3.5%. That's what you need to keep in mind now, the relative moves. You shouldn't worry about the fiat price of silver as long as you have the physical, and the same thing goes for gold. So silver's at 1655. Gold is actually almost unchanged at 1632, down a couple of dollars. Range has been 1630 to 1650. So what about the foreign exchange market? Well, it's still fairly quiet. Sterling is unchanged, 128.18. The euro hasn't really reacted too much to this travel ban. It's up 0.2% actually at 112.93. The dollar's down 2/3 versus the Japanese yen at 103.86. A WTI crude down 4% at 31.87. So that's not surprising with what's happened overnight and the Trump announcement. Just to finish off the markets, let's have a look at where the bond markets are. So the 10-year yield is a little lower this morning by 3.5 basis points. So it looks like people are going back into treasuries. So the yield's at 0.79, but still way above the recent low at around 32 basis points. What about the Trump stimulus package as well? Well, a few days ago, there's a lot of optimism that he was going to introduce a payroll tax freeze, but that went out the window. So there doesn't seem to be too much agreement between the administration and Congress, and they haven't really come up with anything. If anything, the only thing Mnuchin, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, is talking about is guaranteeing loans, which is basically a backdoor bailout, guaranteeing loans for corporations, as Greg Mannarino said in his video yesterday that I listened to. And it's probably going to get even worse in terms of government interference. Who knows? Will they bail out things if we've got ICE 9, which I'm going to come up to now. So what is ICE 9? Well, yeah, Jim Rickards referenced this phenomenon in The Road to Ruin, the global elite's secret plan for the next financial crisis. So I would have to say this is it. I think we can safely say now that this is it. This is the financial crisis that we were expecting after the 08 crisis. And this is, of course, going to be even bigger. So I'm going to actually reference an article Jim Rickards wrote in the Daily Reckoning website, January 23rd, 2017. And I'll put a link to this article below in the comment section, or sorry, in the description. So let's read through the ICE 9 lockdown. So this is what Jim Rickards says, or what he wrote in the article. I'm often asked, does ICE 9 put gold at risk of lockdown or confiscation? So he's going to explain what ICE 9 is. First, ICE 9 is a phrase borrowed from author Kurt Vonnegut. Vonnegut wrote a book in the early 1960s called Cat's Cradle, and it's a doomsday scenario. In Cat's Cradle, a doomsday machine is created. Scientists discovered a molecule called ICE 9, very similar to water, with two differences. Number one, It has a melting point of 114.4 degrees Fahrenheit, which means it's frozen at room temperature. The other characteristic is if a molecule of ice 9 comes in contact with a molecule of water, the water turns to ice 9. In other words, it turns to a form of ice. The plot of the book was that there was only a small amount of this ice 9, and the scientist gave it to his 3 children in vials. As long as the vials were sealed, it was all good. If you open the vial and pour the ice 9 into a stream, the stream would freeze and the lake would freeze. A river would freeze, a ocean would freeze, the entire planet would freeze. We would be in the new ice age and life on Earth would be wiped out. It's a doomsday machine, he says. I took that as a metaphor to explain what's going to happen in the financial system and the next financial crisis. This is really what my book, The Road to Ruin, is about. I described all the critical details in The Road to Ruin. So here's the interesting part, important part, and maybe even a bit too late now to put into effect. So he says physical gold and silver are the answer to ice 9. I don't think they are in jeopardy in an ice 9 scenario. I think that gold and silver are one of the ways to survive ice 9. In the crisis of 1998, which I was very involved in negotiating a solution, that's when LTCM collapsed, the Asian crisis, debt crisis, when Russia was a year later, they went bust. But LTCM was a hedge fund that Jim Rickards used to work for. Prior to the crisis of 1998, what we saw in 1998, says Jim Rickards, was Wall Street get together and bail out the hedge funds, long-term capital management, LTCM. Then in 2008, the central banks got together and bailed out Wall Street. In the next crisis, 2018, or maybe sooner or later, I think it's 2020 really now, maybe tomorrow, who's going to bail out the central banks? Each bailout gets bigger than the one before. Each crisis gets bigger than the one before. We are now at the point where the ability of central banks to liquefy the system is in doubt because they're heavily stretched. Central banks' balance sheets are extremely bloated. Central banks have printed so much money already, it's not obvious that they can do it again from the current levels without destroying confidence in the dollar and all major currencies. The question is, where will the liquidity come from the next financial crisis if it can't come from the central banks? The answer is the IMF, says Jim Rickards. The International Monetary Fund has the only clean balance sheet out of the major financial institutions. It can print money. They call it SDR. Well, that's the special drawing rights. This, and he says he calls it the new world money. That could be right, unfortunately, for those who don't want a world money from the IMF. IMF, of course, is basically the international arm, I would say, of the U.S. Treasury. It works along with the World Bank. The IMF can flood the market and the world with trillions of SDRs, equivalent to more than trillions of dollars, which is exactly how they'll do it. There is a problem with this model at the IMF, though. It's got a 24-member executive committee representing 24 nations around the world or groups of nations. Every 5 years, they change the voting rights. Rickards says it so happens that 2017 is one of those 5-year reviews where they're going to increase the voting rights of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, the BRICS. The so-called BRICS are going to get more votes and potential veto power within the IMF model. When it comes time for the IMF to issue world money, SDRs, to reliquify the world, there's going to be a negotiation period. It will take months to complete. During the last crisis, this took 11 months. That was when the crisis hit in September 2008. We saw Lehman Brothers hit a crisis. The IMF began to issue SDRs in August 2009. Even though they react on a case basis, it's going to take an estimated 3 to 4 months at least to get SDRs issued. In that interim period between the crisis and the time the IMF can react, central banks will be paralyzed. They're likely going to lock down the system. So that's where ICE 9 comes, locking down the system. When I say lockdown, Jim Rickards, they'll start with money market funds. I can't think of a greater misnomer than the money market funds. People think that money market funds are money. They're not money. They're mutual funds regulated by the SEC. People think they can just call up their broker, sell to the money market fund, and the money is in my bank account the next day. That will not be true in this crisis because everyone will be doing the same thing. That is what happened in 2008 when Ben Bernanke and Hank Paulson went to the White House and said to the president that the system's melting down and he must act. That was such a shock then that when it happens again, they're not going to give you your money. They're going to lock it down. The problem is, this is where the ICE 9 metaphor comes in, is that when it is spreading, you can't just lock down part of the system. If you lock down money market funds, people are just going to take their money out of the banks. Then you're going to have to close the banks. Then people are going to sell their stocks. Then you're going to have to close the stock market. Every time you shut one path to liquidity, people are going to turn to another path. The metaphor of ICE 9 is that it spreads from molecule to molecule, institution to institution, requiring a freeze on the entire system. So this is where it's interesting because it wouldn't be the first time. He says it happened in part in 1914, 1931, 1933, and to gold in 1971. There's no precedent for a total freeze, but we're getting close to that point. The question is, how do you protect yourself against that? There's only so much you can do. I don't recommend running down and pulling all your money out of the bank. I would not have more than the insured amount, which is in the US, $250,000. You can spread it between your selected banks so that each is backed and insured up to the limit. So this is the important part here about gold and silver. Jim Rickards says the thing about gold and silver is that it needs to be in physical form and safe storage and a non-bank. Putting it in the safety deposit box in the bank is troublesome because by the time you want it the most, that will be when the banks are going to be closed. So almost finished here. That's ICE 9. In the world described, the dollar price of gold will approach the 10,000 level, if not much higher. Don't wait on gold because when all of this begins to play out, you're not going to be able to get gold. ICE 9 is a freeze of the financial system. It's something that's happened before. It'll happen again in the next crisis. Physical gold and silver is the answer to ICE 9, and you should get it while you still can. Jim Rickards. So, yeah, I truly believe that we are at a juncture where anything could happen to the system. Just like President Trump banned all travel from Europe starting tomorrow, he could completely shut down the financial system. As you saw, you can't just shut down one part of the system because people will try to get their money out from other parts. So it's going to be a complete lockdown. And when the Americans do that, it will reverberate all across the world. No one's going to be immune. So there you go. Let's hope it doesn't happen. but it's looking more and more likely that it will. So yeah, if you can still get physical gold and silver, try to get some. You still got a little bit of time. So if you enjoyed this video, make sure you hit the like button, share it far and wide. Think about subscribing to the channel if you haven't yet. And you can also follow me on Twitter, Facebook, BitChute, Steemit, and DTube. I wish you all a great day. Take care. Bye.